to fill almost a void in the automation space. But that was never really my vision per se, to just have another RPA product to compete with, industry staples. What we did, though, is work on a roadmap that would extract the most value out of the space. Now, why we built Roboteer was to make a product that had a low barrier to entry. So we wanted to be affordable. We wanted to have a straightforward pricing model where you pay per bot installation on a desktop machine, not by process, not by volume of 3 or 4 bots. In most large sort of enterprise RPA products, you've got to take a minimum quota. You've got to sign up for training. There's quite a high barrier to entry. The other thing that really got to me working with contemporary RPA solutions was the steep learning curve, the expensive training. And once a solution had been placed in an enterprise, they were reliant on third-party contractors that were qualified, quote unquote, to modify and maintain these automation solutions. So we built Roboteer with the developer experience as the first-class citizen. And the idea is to empower in-house resources to be able to develop not only their own processes, but develop processes that they've had kickstarted through professional services. The platform itself is lightweight, heavy lifting. The idea is that it's embedded, all-inclusive, no third-party dependencies. A lot of the environments where Roboteer operates are, quote-unquote, air-gapped, where there's no access to the outside world. It's all dependencies are included, and the architecture is a simple web server with WebSocket support, and the robot itself is a client. Roboteer itself is actually first and foremost a general purpose visual development platform. If you're familiar with the game space, the model there would be Unreal Engine. A lot of the edge cases that sort of eluded more contemporary solutions required more of a visual development aspect to cater for those edge cases instead of turnkey integrations. Another thing that was lacking in the space was having a reactive engine to program orchestration and react to different events in the real world and throughout systems, but also to react to distributed workloads. Particularly in the banking space, time is of the essence and volumes are important. So you need to be able to break up large queues of work across multiple machines and have them reconcile automatically. To support that kind of development, Roboteer ships with a real-time data storage engine, similar to something like Google Firebase, where you design models you can generate quite complex validated forms for that. The data is stored in the cloud or on your local installation, and you can subscribe to that database and get real-time updates. The computer vision and OCR is also built into that embeddable server distribution. So there's no dependencies on things like Google Vision or any sort of services from Amazon and Azure. Same with the OCR. And it's also designed to be extended. As a developer myself, there are certain things that you can't have sight of. So if you need to develop something custom, getting information into custom code, whether it's Python, Node, C#, anything like that, and getting data back out is very straightforward. And also, Roboteer can be the glue between multiple systems. The idea is that it's something that you can place and use side by side with existing solutions without having to rip and replace.
Right. But just before you continue, I just want to kind of know the thinking on your kind of OCR recognition. So you said there's no kind of third-party dependencies. How do you manage then the kind of object side around kind of processes that has been driven in applications from a kind of graphical aspect. Is that OCR capability that Roboteer build themselves, or how does that actually work in the overall solution?
Everything that I've described is programmable inside of Roboteer with a visual designer. You don't need to actually know any contemporary scripting language. It is all visual. All the commands are set up in a standard fashion. There is a system for there's a system for order of execution and data flow, and that is managed by several entities within the system. I'll detail those when I go through the demo, so you can see firsthand how the work is actually done.
Right.
So as I mentioned earlier, Roboteer was born in a banking incubator to meet the challenges of complex legacy systems that fell outside the capabilities of more contemporary automation solutions. And as mentioned earlier, workloads in a finite window needing to be completed in parallel across multiple machines was of high importance. We also needed to ensure that all of the entire platform was built on open source, but secure enough to run in the strictest network environments. The intention was to make Roboteer a tool to accelerate existing developers as well. So using the record store real-time database, it becomes a nice back-end solution for front-end developers. So if you have front-end developers that are skilled in perhaps Angular or React and don't have the experience to launch production-ready database solutions or communication solutions, Roboteer is a good option for them to use a visual programming interface and develop a back-end for their front-end application. And obviously, budget is a big concern. It's proven in production. Within NetBank itself, we run high-scale jobs, processing thousands of records with 3 bots working 24/7. The main thing that we're automating is MDM, which is similar to a CRM system in the bank. It's developed by IBM. It's incredibly complex and it's incredibly slow and temperamental. And this particular area was burning a lot of man hours. So we save upwards of 300 man hours a month in the automations in just one process, and we currently run 3. And the folks just don't have the manpower to capture all the updates coming from various systems inside the bank, particularly biometrics, because names and relationships are quite complex. And the bot handles that. Right now, I'm looking at my other laptop and I'm busy processing the 1,500 that have to be through in the 24-hour window that we have, because notifications have to go out to those customers. So there is highly critical business application for this with large return on investment when it comes to time savings of actual resources. We're also automating a lot of document processing and forensic and drawing reports out of the data that's being processed. So with that high-level introduction to Roboteer, let's actually jump into what the operators and developers will be working with. So at the top level, Roboteer offers reactive services. You could think of this as a web service. A service runs on the server at a central point. The server is built on Node.js, but it's compiled into a single binary, so it's easy to ship. All dependencies are included. It runs on Windows. We recommend running it on a Linux, perhaps Ubuntu server, just because of the upgrading of connections is much more efficient. And you could actually run it on a Mac as well. So it's multi-platform, the server. This is the central point where you would orchestrate work from. So a service offers a series of reactors, and reactors are a mechanism that allow the outside world to interact with work that you've built inside of Roboteer. And we have a variety of reactors, things like manual inputs, where the forms are designed inside of Roboteer, modeled and validated. You can select records from your existing real-time databases. We offer API endpoints. So if you're familiar with Postman or working with any sort of REST applications, you can dial right into Roboteer, and it also offers a WebSocket interface. So you can get live feedback out of the system. Obviously, the traditional kind of schedules, and obviously file uploads, among many others. When a reactor is triggered, it creates a reaction. Now, this reaction is programmed by, well, the work that's done in this reaction is determined by a blueprint that we call a job. Now, a job essentially is a visual programming interface with a flow, and you have a series of commands that are flat in their organization, meaning that each of these command settings are very minimal. No one command does a huge amount of things to make it, complex to learn, and also limits or makes something highly specialized. General control, alerts, all sorts of things from the job level, a lot of logic. So this is where the general programming comes in. Things like repeats, being able to map data explicitly, because it's quite a granular interface, does give it a competitive advantage over contemporary RPA, where normally you are only programming the execution flow. They normally only give you sort of one wire to connect, and those are the green and blue. So blue would indicate your alternative flow, and then this would be a logic switch over here. This is a conditional command. So very quickly, you can see the order of execution by the green lines. We have a flow down the side that actually orders the execution of those commands, and you can then pipe data from one command to another, which is quite intuitive to people with developer experience. Each of the commands is fully documented. We have a extensive range of documentation for experienced developers that would like to self-study the system. And we've had a lot of good feedback on this, not just from developer type people, but also sort of technical guys that have been using Roboteer in the bank for their DevOps to manage their VM clusters and snapshot their very large hard drives. So this is the main orchestration center.
Just a second, Barry, on that orchestration layer of the kind of flows, how do you deal with time dependency flows, by way of example, where you need to wait for a certain level of synchronization in systems? How would that happen here?
So there's different ways that you could handle that. You could wait for events. So you can wait for records to change. You can wait for reactions to complete. You have a schedule, and that schedule is essentially a cron job where you could potentially ping systems over REST. You could subscribe to Kafka queues. It all depends on the situation. That's the beauty of Roboteer, is it's a general programming platform first. So we don't prescribe to say you can only integrate with these systems. We give you general tools that could allow you to subscribe to multiple systems. Depends what kind of systems what kind of alerts that you're looking for.
Right. Yeah, I'm just thinking, because you've spoken about the kind of banking sector and the transactional kind of side in finance, good kind of use case here on the CRM. I was just thinking in the context of kind of IBM and how CRM would kind of interact with a customer using a kind of feedback mechanism that they need to wait to get feedback on. And how do you kind of manage that kind of dependencies in that kind of workflows to say, okay, once a sub process is completed, that process needs to be completed first before we can continue on to the next stage in the kind of workflow.
Correct. So with with stateful reactions, generally, particularly with this one, there is actually a custom scheduling section here where I'm running a schedule, but I'm also checking databases to see if there's things that match in that schedule. You know, if there was a scenario where further user input was required, you could then signal an operator using a general purpose alert. You could send an email that directs them, and you can add another reactor to pick up the job where it left off, if that makes sense. Particularly with things like two-factor authentication, if you've got to wait for that input, this solution itself actually uses two-factor authentication, but it's desktop-based. Sometimes you're not so lucky, you might have external real-world devices, small dongles and cell phone only type things, where you need to alert a user to say, look, you need to give us a code so the bot can continue its job, and that can all be managed within the Job Studio.
Right. Yeah, because that would have, my next question would have been to say, okay, in the construct of your current use case, there's obviously the identity component to it, which depends on the banking environments. How do they manage their identity with their customer? So if you've got a single sign-on component across the systems, because that CRM system will go down to a subsystems to get some data that it needs to complete the process, as well as then authenticate certain components from an end user or customer perspective. So the process could be quite complex in nature.
Yes, absolutely. So for this particular example, without getting too technical, there's two types of records that you can store. You can store a record list, which would be like a live Excel, and you would get you could hook onto any of the events, add, delete, updates like a trigger, and then you can attach that to a visually programmed flow, or you can have a single record, which like this. When I last ran the schedule, it was late afternoon on Thursday, and you can maintain state of something. So every time this runs, it updates to say this was the last time I ran. The next time I run, I check against it to see if it's changed. In the same sense, you can source those events multiple ways. You could have a webhook. A lot of systems do offer like a callback kind of solution, and in that webhook, you would just put a Reactor API call, and it would then post the information that you're waiting for and trigger something else, another reaction. Or there could be something that updates in a database that you could periodically check for, or you could put a subscriber down that would listen to some kind of network event. There's many ways that you can achieve your goal through Riveteer.
Right.
So that's at the orchestration level. So this runs in the cloud, and you can obviously assign the work that needs to be done to a machine in a swarm. So we have a simple idea where you create teams of robots, and it has a bit of intelligence in it that has a sort of round robin type algorithm where the first machine available is then given the job to do. And a robot is not much more than the clients. It's a desktop application. It can run in the background. It's got the small interfaces to show you the machine that it's currently registered as, and who I'm logged in as, and what the work queue is. You can install this across multiple devices. Currently, I only have one device connected to this particular server, but then it would then essentially delegate the work down automatically to machines that you add to different swarms. So you might have something that runs in one environment, like a QA environment perhaps, or a staging environment, and then pushes it to a production environment, or something that runs in two different data centers. The work that is actually executed on the robot is vastly more enhanced, vastly more rich, because you want to limit the amount of capabilities you give users to run on the server. because it is the central point. But the bots, there really is the full palette where you can work with apps, Excel, PDFs. You can select applications from the system. Obviously, your clipboard, control your input and output. So a macro is essentially a function. It takes data in, it does some work, and it puts data out like a function would. And you can run nested macros. You can run a macro inside of a macro. So if you encapsulate your work in a macro, I have a Xero login over here. And if I do any work with the Xero platform, I will reuse this macro to log in and to handle the two-factor authentication every time. Even this navigation is quite general purpose. And at each command step, you have a red flow. So you can handle errors at each step of the, at each step of the process. And if you leave it unhandled, you get a final event, a final error handler that you can, have a general error, or you can just let it throw the error and handle it at a job level. So that's essentially the architecture. It's a functional design. It's inspired by functional programming, and you can do things like tail recursion in this. It's quite powerful. Full control of your file system. It has a very fast file find engine. It can scan entire hard drives very quickly. You've got a sort of mini Photoshop where you can adjust, crop, flip images, especially useful for OCR if you want to improve the quality of images before putting it through OCR. Full control of the keyboard and a very extensive logic library, various types of repeats, converting between different data types, filtering, manipulating data, built-in fuzzy logic searches with the nearest neighbor type algorithms, and a lot of conversions between cases. All the stuff that I use in my own sort of day-to-day programming have been included here. On top of that, you've got your full range of computer vision stuff where you can select UI elements from a desktop application based on screenshots. And the advantage of this is you don't need tight coupling with the operating system and rely on the operating system to tell you what elements are available, because in certain platforms like the older Javas and Electron, you won't get that information. And it also opens up the door to be cross-platform, that's how we get it to work for desktop applications on Apples as well. You can select and you can detect colors. Please just hold on a sec. And you can also extract text from an image, and it has a mechanic to extract table data. So if you take a screenshot of Excel, you could then extract the information out of those cells and return it in a structured tabular format. There's extensive browser automation. We use the Playwright engine from Microsoft, and it can automate Edge, Chrome, and if you add an extension, it can also do Firefox. Firefox is very sort of uncommon, so we left that as an optional extra. But here you can control the browser with simulated keyboard and mouse, so that will allow you to run the browser headless and in the background if you have shared machines. Full set of REST commands, so you can make REST requests directly from your robot. And then a miscellaneous assortment of powerful sort of admin features, like being able to execute the command line. And what this will do is we'll actually return the text from the standard out. So if you want to run a Python script, you can really just print out a JSON string, convert that JSON string into structured data inside a Roboteer, and interface very easily between custom code and the code in Roboteer. And we have a number of extensions that you can include in your code and run the macros for those extensions for interfacing directly with Outlook or Excel or anything like that, if there's something that you need. SQL queries, we do MySQL, SQLite, Postgres, Oracle, and MS SQL. So you can execute queries directly from your robot. fetching emails, extracting EML files for, deeply nested emails, sending emails, PowerShell commands, very powerful. You can run this as a simulated user, so you can change the domain and username, which generally, if you're running PowerShell, you have like system admin accounts that you might want to run under, and zipping and unzipping files. So it's a lot of difficult things to implement, every time in a coding project that's readily available that you can just drag, drop, and play. And with all the sort of general programming type principles that we've applied to this in the functional flow, you can create custom solutions that really are quite powerful and very bespoke, sort of knocking down your development cycle quite considerably. And if there's something that Roboteer doesn't do, you jump into Roboteer through an API that you specify. So on this particular job, I have an API endpoint and a manual input, and they use the same record. So if we go to the data store and I go down into the record.
Larry, just one question that comes to mind. Just to take your current use case around the MDM, the CRM side of things. So obviously that system would have a set of objects. So by way of example, there will be object for your username, there will be object for your password, and then subsequently all the processes. Do you in Roboteer have a object library for those that you can reuse?
Absolutely.
So okay, so if every time I don't want to rebuild my process to do my authentication processes, so how does that work in context of Roboteer?
So what traditionally people call models, I call a shape in Roboteer. So a shape is not actually data, but it's the shape of the data, and you have basically all the types of all kinds of data types, and you can do nested complex types like a data item, which is a key value store, or a list within it. You drag those fields into your model, and each of them are configurable with their own validation rules, and you can create quite complex commands or controls, form controls, like your segment selects, your drop downs. And once you have that shape, it's essentially a type in your system. And this type you would then use to define your record stores. So in a record store, it's asking you which shape would you like this record store to use as the template to store data. So it's also real time. So in this particular shape, I've got a user account, basic user account, which I'll show you in the demo a little bit later. And I can add extra fields to it. So if I had a follow-on action, save that, we can see the action there. Quite useful. It gives you the JSON schema as well. So if you're using OpenAPI or a form generator, this is very useful. And it'll also give you the output view. So from there, if we jump back to the data store that uses the shape, we can see that straight away it's added that action field. So it's real time in that regard. That same shape you then use inside of your jobs, and that will allow you to select and manipulate fields very easily. On the macro side, however, we also have dynamic data types. So something like this data item, I can define the fields at runtime, if that makes sense. So you can use perhaps a base, or if you need to transform data from one source and the fields need to be somewhat dynamic, then you can also transform that into your shape, if that makes sense.
Yeah, so yeah, ultimately, and so that allows you then to deal with kind of pop-ups. So say for instance, you process a new record, a new fundamental transaction that gives us a kind of a transaction ID, and that transaction ID pops up on the screen. So can you then capture that via the macro or from those?
Yes, it would be from the macro, and depending on what platform it is, if it's a web application, you could then use your web automation commands. Like this one is for filling inputs. This one is for waiting for an element to appear on the screen. This one's for clicking it. So after looking under the hood and seeing how all of this stuff comes together, once it's come together and you need to run something, you trigger a reactor. This particular reactor allows me to select existing records from my record store. The accounts that it is going to reconcile is also managed in Roboteer. All of these forms are custom. There's a lot of sort of configuration elements that were put in here custom, and then I can actually build a very bespoke solution for our partners. So what this will do the first time I run it is I'm going to run the demo account, and what it will do in Xero is take the invoices that have been logged inside of Xero, and Xero connects to bank accounts and external data sources like flat files and stuff like that, and it attempts to match as close as it can the invoice to the transaction, but there's still a manual vetting process, and that becomes very time consuming for accountants. So the first thing I'll do is select a record out of my record store, and that's going to trigger a job which will open the browser. It's going to log in. It's going to say, okay, I need to do two-factor authentication. It opens the Twilio Authy app. It's just having a read through the screen to see which of it matches. And then it will take that code, copy it in. Once it logs in, it's basically found the reset demo button already. Once this loads, it's going to interrogate this dashboard because the layout tends to change, and it's evaluating the bank account that I gave it, which is the business bank account. And once it finds it, it'll click the reconcile items button. And if something happens with the site, which can happen quite frequently, where the site just doesn't respond or it throws an error, that error is raised in the system. So because
and will it then, Barry, will it then send out a notification to the developer to tell them that there's the issue, obviously?
Yes,
okay.
Absolutely. You have different avenues that you could pipe it through. Email. If you have your own systems, you could connect to something perhaps like a service desk, something like Jira.
Oh, okay, cool.
Just to say that something failed, or if it did fail, then you could just tell it to retry a certain number of times. This particular account doesn't retry because it's a reset. And you can see I started the browser up with a persistent state this time. Previously, I was running it anonymously, or in, what would you call it, incognito mode.
And then when it logs that error into Jira, for example, will it then log it with a screenshot, or?
You can absolutely take a screenshot. The error message that comes back, well, it's really up to you. Mm-hmm. You can pipe that error in however you like. So there you saw that the site itself didn't throw a 501 error this time. Mm-hmm. So there we can see the invoices on the left-hand side, and there are three conditions that the bot is looking for, where Xero automatically has attempted to match the transactions to one another. One where there's a rule set up by the accountant, which it will execute, and that will add to the balance. or where there's no rule created, it will add a note for the accountant to say, please create a rule for this so we can action it next time. The tricky bit about this screen is, as you can see, the sort of like the loading bubbles there, it will start loading fields from the next screen as you're processing. So what that particular process does is a bit of tail recursion. So every time it finishes a page, it goes back, waits to see if there's anything new, and then actions it. If nothing new comes back within the time frame, it then continues on to the next page. So now that set is complete, and there was one account processed. So if we go have a look at what the billing log looks like, it was set up custom. Roboteer does obviously also a full cloud folder solution, so you can create your own folders. You can set permissions, share them with members of your team. In this particular one, I am looking for my logs. So this record store now has a new line item for today's date. That was the time it started, that was the time it ended, and these were fields that are custom for this job. I fill them with data that I generate throughout the job, and I calculate the duration of the job. While it's going, I'm counting how many transactions were processed, where the report at the end, I don't know if you saw that, but there was an Excel report that was downloaded, and it also uploaded that Excel report into Roboteer's cloud storage. So Roboteer has something similar to Google Drive or Dropbox or OneDrive, and if I pop that link into the browser, it allows me to download the report that came out of the system. And then obviously that's timestamped with an ID for me to refer to later. I can modify any of these records with the forms that were defined by the shape that I showed earlier. So you can extend or remove fields as you need. There's another reactor that allows you to pull down the billing reports, but for a specific date range, for a specific customer, and you can fill it into a specific folder. Once that runs, I'll get an alert to show me where that report was downloaded to. So if I go and access that now, we'll see that the last one that was modified was at 11 o'clock. Pop that open, and we can see that's the same data that came out of the actual job that we ran through just now. The error that happened earlier was also logged, and I can use that for later inspection. So this particular job, obviously, because there's a data store for the accounts, as the job grows, more accounts are added, and it runs through each of the accounts that are selected. But each account has its own sort of custom schedule that you can program. So this one's currently not running on a schedule, but I added the fields to allow this to run daily or monthly. You give it a time slot. The job runs every sort of 2 hours, so you can pick a slot that it wants to run in, the day of the week that you want it to run it in, or the day of the month, depending. And this is separate from the actual schedule itself. It's a custom piece of logic. If you've got time, I'd just like to show you something quick to do with the OCR.
Sure, I do. I think the traffic in my hallway is quiet tonight.
So I've got this screenshot of our training partners output from another job, but if I wanted to recapture this into the system, because for whatever reason this was the only backup that they had, as you can see, the screenshot's quite tedious if you had to capture it manually. So this particular demo, I've got the shape set up to capture a user account record into an online system, and I can enter the details manually, but I actually want those details to come from an image. So I'm going to select that image that we saw earlier and click continue. and it's going to extract the information out of the image. I've written a macro that will then go and select the data from the fields that it found. And once it's found it, it's going to go and then capture it into the site. So there we can see RB Jacobs. It goes pretty quickly. And it will update that response that came back from the system into a data store in Roboteer. So if we pop down into the user accounts, we can see that RB Jacobs was now captured. And the status that came back from the site was this user has not been registered. If we have a look at the data that was extracted from the image, it's pretty accurate. There were a couple of fields that I wasn't interested in. So if we look at the RB, it recognized that there was a dot at the end there as well.
Yes, yeah.
I changed the date format to work with the date format that I'd chosen for the system. So in the job, I'd actually pulled out this date and then changed the format. It picked up the age, the gender, and the South African citizen just fine. I wasn't looking for passwords, but the email came through correctly, which is a good thing.
That's awesome. Yeah. The reason why I'm always asking about the screen capture, next time when you need to replicate that error to show the developers, it's normally not
100%.
It's gone.
So with the web automation and having a drag drop, it's a very welcome tool for sort of acceptance testing. So if you've got your unit test, that's one thing, but your integration test where you've actually got to test it in different browser sizes, if you're doing responsive websites, having Roboteer instead of having to write those scripts is a blessing for me, especially at my age. And finally, I've got a spreadsheet of users, and I can upload that spreadsheet into the system, and it will extract the data from that spreadsheet.
It's like a data-driven approach when you do your testing then.
100%. So you could generate, if you've got something like Faker, you could have a Faker server running. You could use the REST commands in your robot to generate fake data and then go and actually run tests against your software. Regression testing can be done with a plugin that we offer, which essentially does a pixel by pixel comparison.
So, yeah, that's powerful. Yeah.
Outside of that, obviously, you can call you can call any of these reactors essentially from an API. So here I've just got a simple Postman request. If I wanted to generate a request for that API, I could fill in my details. Let's see if it allows me. And it will give me the details for the URL, the header with your user token intact, and the request body. And you can simply paste that in to Postman. So it does make development quite essentially easier. So if I send one of these, and we can see that reaction started, and it's just going to take the information that I popped in there. And that was the James API, popped out of there. And if I need to then either subscribe to this endpoint, because it's also a WebSocket endpoint, or if I wanted to query this endpoint, I would just put my reaction ID in, and then we can see it gives you all the data and the output from that job, and you can monitor the status. So full access in and out, like everything in Roboteer is available over an API. The authentication is JWT based. It uses your current login. You can also use your robots token. It just has slightly less access over your work for security reasons. And that's Roboteer in a nutshell.